Okay. So welcome to this class on Lama Zopa Rinpoche's book, How Things Exist. And there'll be 4 sessions. This session will probably be a little bit short because I'm not feeling really well tonight, but I did want to introduce the material. And one of the things I want to mention, in case you didn't notice this, is that this book is available online. There should have been a link on the Zoom login page. I didn't actually notice whether or not it was there.
It was there. I've used it. There's a free PDF you can download.
Okay, and you can also read it online. So the first thing I want to do is I want to do a screen share and go to the table of contents of this book online. Let's see if I can accomplish this. Looks like that I did. There's some stuff in the background, so I just have to put up with that because I have a lot of windows at the moment that are on this computer monitor. So the book is titled How Things Exist. The subtitle is Teachings on Emptiness. So this is one of the more difficult subjects in the Buddhist teachings. And it's difficult enough that over 2,500 years, various Buddhist schools have understood this particular teaching on how things exist, which is to say their emptiness nature, which I'll go into more, in various different ways. There's a specific way in which Lama Zopa Rinpoche teaches about how things exist, and that's the Prasangika Madhyamaka view. This view originates with Chandrakirti, but was really, I don't know if popularized is the right word, but it became the view of the Gelug school of Buddhism with Tsongkhapa, this particular view, but it's not the only view, okay? And in past teachings that I've done, I have referred to other views that I found useful, but I'm not going to focus very much on that, on those alternatives, because this is a class on Zopa Rinpoche's book, which takes that particular view. But let me begin by saying that he's divided the book up into these chapters. The first one being universal responsibility, and the second one is how things exist. Universal responsibility refers to bodhicitta, refers to compassion for all beings, and he opens that, which might seem like an unusual way to open a book or to begin a book on the emptiness nature of phenomena, which is more about ontology. How do things exist? That's what ontology is. And you wouldn't think that that would necessarily include anything about compassion. But in the Buddhist teachings, especially in this particular approach that comes from Tsongkhapa, who's the originator of the entire Gelug lineage that FPMT is in, and that obviously then Lama Zopa is in, compassion teachings are actually a logical or a natural consequence of understanding the nature of emptiness, which seems a little bit unusual. And that's the theme that I'm going to want to begin with. So his second chapter, then, he goes into how do things exist. Then he places those teachings in the context of Lamrim. And if you're paying attention to what goes on at Thubten Norbuling, you know that the Lamrim teachings, the stages to the path to enlightenment, which is what Lamrim means. This is the basic teaching that Geshe Sherab presents at Thubten Norbuling on a regular basis. Okay. The next chapter, 4 different ways of looking at things, are traditional analytic ways of understanding the nature of emptiness. The next chapter, chapter 5, merely labeled is actually where we're going to begin, because Zopa Rinpoche emphasizes this. And the fact that things are merely labeled, I'll get into what that means in greater detail, is sort of the key prasangika understanding of why things are empty. Or to be more specific, why things are empty of inherent existence. Because a typical mistake that's made by people when they first encounter the teachings on emptiness is they think that emptiness means nothingness. That things are empty means that there's nothing there. And that's absolutely an incorrect understanding. What things are empty of is something specific, but it doesn't mean that things are non-existent. Things are empty of what's called inherent existence. So they lack a specific nature, a specific character. And that's what they're empty of. When I say they lack it, it means that's what they're empty of. There really is not a good English, there's not really a good way to talk about these teachings in English. At this point, I talk about the emptiness nature of things, just because it's the closest reasonable English I can find to what you would find in Tibetan or Sanskrit. What I used to talk about was the devoid nature of things, that things are devoid of certain characters. Other people have said things are void of certain characters, but I think that English sort of leads to some misunderstandings that things are void or voidness, which means nothingness. Devoidness implies things are empty of something, but it's terrible English to talk about the devoid nature of things. So I come back to talking about the emptiness nature of things. Okay. So to kind of get more into the material, I'm not going to start with the chapter on the universal responsibility, as Lama Zopa talks about, or compassion. I'm going to really begin with this chapter, How Things Exist. And I'm going to begin with 2 paragraphs that I've extracted from the book that will kind of launch us into the discussion. So let me do another screen share, and let's see if I can get this right. Hold on a minute. Yeah, there we go. I think I'm learning how to do this. Oh, look at this. I've got both pages. How unusual. All right, that's fine. I never know what I'm going to get when I do a screen share. So this, on this side, is these are the quotations from the second chapter by Zopa Rinpoche. And let me just read these, because I think some people like to listen to this material, and some people are looking at it. I think that since these are short, it might be useful for people if I read them also. So Rinpoche says, the first point is that the base is not the table. He's using the example of you walk into a room and you see a table. And he's drawing a distinction between what you see and what's actually there. What you see is a table. What's actually there is what he calls the base, upon which you understand the nature of table. He goes on, he says, when you come into the room, how do you come to apply labels to things? You can see that the reason you use to apply a label to something is not that thing. You use seeing the base of the table as the reason to label table. But this object that can be used to put things on is not a table. You apply the label table after seeing the base. It's clear that the base and the label are different. Well, actually, for most people, it's not at all clear. And we're going to talk about why that is. He goes on a little bit later in the chapter. He says, this is the correct way to meditate on the emptiness of the table. By recognizing that the table appears to you to be independent, unlabeled, real from its own side, You then search for that table to see whether or not it exists. When you don't find it, and you see that it's empty, at that time you're seeing the emptiness or ultimate nature of the table. By seeing the ultimate truth of the table, that is completely empty of existing from its own side. As a result, you then realize the conventional truth of the table, that the table exists in mere name, being merely imputed by the mind. This is subtle dependent arising. Now, if you studied Madhyamaka, you might understand what this means. If you haven't studied Madhyamaka, I think it's going to sound incomprehensible to you. So my job in this class is going to try to explain what Lama Zopa means in those two paragraphs. And I'm going to do it in a slightly roundabout way, but I am going to do it. And hopefully by the end of the class, you'll understand exactly what Lama Zopa means in those two paragraphs and what his intention is in talking about how things exist, and then how that leads to the attitude of compassion or bodhicitta, which is a different way of existing in our world, because one understands the world in a different kind of way. So what I'm going to do by way of moving in that direction of starting to develop this understanding is I'm going to do something that's perhaps a little bit roundabout. First off, I'm going to go back to where does this view of emptiness come from? So I think some of you know anyway that I'm a philosophy professor. Sometimes I've been a professor of religious studies. So this is just sort of the way I do things. I refer to books, and I tend to take a little bit of a scholarly view toward the material and bring other books and other essays into the material that I'm presenting, because I think that it's useful. In this case, though, a little bit of a history lesson. So as I indicated earlier on in this talk, Zopa Rinpoche and the whole Gaelic tradition goes back to Tsongkhapa, 14th century Tibetan teacher, who was very charismatic, probably enlightened. I mean, if you read the literature, you read things by people like Thupten Jinpa, who's the main English translator for His Holiness when he's on tour in English-speaking countries. The view is that he was a Buddha. He was enlightened, that Tsongkhapa was enlightened. I have no way to know if that's true or not. If I ran into an enlightened being, I wouldn't know that that being was enlightened, I don't think. How would I know that? It's sort of like if I tripped over the Buddha, would I know that I tripped over the Buddha? I mean, hard to say. I'm just as ignorant as anybody else. But I might know, because Buddhas are fairly charismatic. And Tsongkhapa was definitely charismatic. I mean, he changed the course of Buddhism in Tibet. One of the things that Tsongkhapa did, though, was in trying to understand the authentic Buddhist teachings, and especially the teachings about emptiness, which is shunyata in Sanskrit. He deferred to the Indian classics, which had been taught in the great Indian monasteries like Nalanda and others. And some of that material had not been seriously attended to in the centuries immediately before Tsongkhapa. Now, in the 11th century, with teachers like Atisha, that material was very important, and it was presented as being very important. And also in the very beginning of Buddhism in Tibet, with teachers like Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, who came from those monasteries, those great Indian monasteries like Nalanda or Vikramashila. They brought those texts to Tibet, and they emphasized the importance of them. But by Tsongkhapa's time, some of that stuff, some of the attitudes had shifted a bit, I think is the best way to phrase it. So he re-emphasized those teachings, and that's been carried through the present day. So His Holiness often says that the Buddhism that he teaches is the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism. He defers to the great Indian monasteries. But who were those teachers that were important? Well, Tsongkhapa focused in specifically on a teacher called Chandrakirti, and his explications of the Buddhist teachings about the nature of reality and so forth. What Chandrakirti was doing, and Chandrakirti was, now I'm forgetting, I think he was 6th century or 7th century, I don't remember anymore. I've reached the age of memory going gate, gate, paragate, beyond, beyond, beyond. So sometimes my dates are pretty problematic. It's embarrassing for a scholar, but it's one of the things that happens when you get old. There doesn't seem to be a lot to do about it. Chandrakirti was an interpreter of the great teacher Nagarjuna. So all of these teachings about emptiness that we're going to be looking at really originate with Nagarjuna, 2nd, 3rd century AD teacher. He was the great philosopher. He was often called the second Buddha. Of course, several people have been called the second Buddha. Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, was sometimes called the second Buddha. But anyhow, Nagarjuna was called the second Buddha. And his teachings influenced Buddhism everywhere in the Mahayana world, which is to say, covered most of Asia. If you're interested in Nagarjuna, you can go to the original, and there are now good translations of Nagarjuna's teachings. And the best thing, his key teaching is called Fundamental Wisdom, or Fundamentals of Wisdom. And in this translation, the Fundamental Wisdom, the Middle Way, translated by J. Garfield. And this is sort of the classic. If you ever want to read Nagarjuna in the original, this is where you would go to this book. It's the best. And there's lots of commentary on the stanzas. Nagarjuna's teachings are in what were called shlokas in Sanskrit. They're 4-line stanzas or poems, and they're fairly cryptic. They can't really be read without a commentary, but Garfield provides commentary that come out of the traditional sources, and he gives the original teachings of Nagarjuna. There are other books that you can go to if you're interested in Nagarjuna. Here's another one that I particularly like. It's called Nagarjuna's 70 Stanzas. I like it because I translated it. So you can go to it for some more Nagarjuna teachings. It's another one of his fundamental texts. And finally, another good book in English. It's called The Buddhism of Tibet. And it contains another Nagarjuna teaching, which is called, I don't know if you can see this, it's The Precious Garland of Advice to the King. I think that's how it's translated here. It's just translated as The Precious Garland. Anyhow, so there you have that. So you can go to any of these things, and you can get Nagarjuna in the raw if you'd like to actually try and work your way into the material. I actually recommend it. It's actually pretty interesting stuff to think about, but it is difficult. You know, that's why there's so many commentaries. And because Nagarjuna was cryptic, there are different ways to translate Nagarjuna and different ways to understand what he was teaching, but I think it's worth a look. So that's the tradition actually that we're talking about here. When we're talking about this book, How Do Things Exist, or How Things Exist rather, excuse me. We're talking about a tradition that's 800 years old. Think about that, right? So Nagarjuna was writing in the 2nd century AD. Well, maybe he wasn't even writing, you know. I mean, people probably wrote down maybe his students wrote down what he was teaching. It's hard to say. Nobody really knows for sure. And then over the centuries, these traditions were carried forward, and the writings were copied and copied again and copied again and copied again on palm leaf manuscripts, by the way, because the Indians didn't have paper. You can imagine what that means over the course of 800 years until it came to Tibet and began to be written on something other than paper. Anyhow, I won't go into that history, but it leads to a lot of misunderstandings, or it has led to a lot of misunderstandings. Chandrakirti, therefore, several hundred years after Nagarjuna, really tried to create a clear understanding of Nagarjuna's teachings. And then almost 1,000 years later, Tsongkhapa did the same thing for the Tibetans. So this is now the tradition that's come down to us. So what does this boil down to, and what's going on with this tradition? So I'm going to explain this first with some more context. So bear with me while I do another screen share. Again, this may seem a little odd, but there's a method to my madness. One of the, let's move this over here. Jay Garfield, who is one of the authors that I referred to, who translated the fundamental teachings of Nagarjuna, the first book that I showed you, got together with a group of other translators. They called themselves the Cowherds. And they were interested in the teachings of the two truths. If you know Guy Newland's work, who was one of the Cowherds, he wrote the book, or wrote a book on the two truths, which is really an excellent book if you want to review this. But what they were interested in is the conventional truth, not the ultimate truth. That things are empty of inherent existence, and experiencing things as such is considered to be the ultimate truth. But they were interested in the conventional truth. So I did something that I don't typically do. I went to Amazon, and these are the descriptions of the two books that the Cowherds have produced on the nature of conventional truth. And just as a teaser, when Lama Zopa was talking about the base in that quotation that I first showed you, he was actually referencing something that's similar to the conventional truth. Not exactly the conventional truth, but sort of. So that's what these folks are interested in. So let me read this also for the benefit of people who don't want to try and read it on the screen. The doctrine of the two truths, a conventional truth and an ultimate truth, the ultimate truth being the emptiness nature of things, is central to Buddhist metaphysics and epistemology. The two truths, or two realities, the distinction between them and the relation between them is understood variously in different Buddhist schools and is of special importance to the Madhyamaka school. The fundamental ideas are articulated with particular force by Nagarjuna, 2nd, 3rd century CE or AD, who famously claims that the two truths are identical to one another and yet distinct. Now, so there's a logical problem for us right away. Two truths that are identical and distinct. How can that be? One of the most influential interpretations of Nagarjuna's difficult doctrine derives from the commentary of Chandrakirti, 6th century CE. Oh, good. So I don't have to remember it. There it is. While much attention has been devoted to explaining the nature of the ultimate truth in view of its special soteriological role, that is, if you know what this means, it means how it saves you, less has been paid to understanding the nature of conventional truth, which is often described as deceptive, illusion, or truth for fools. But conventional truth is nonetheless truth. This book therefore asks, what is true about conventional truth? And what are the implications for an understanding of conventional truth for our lives? That's part of what I want to emphasize in these lectures. What are the implications of an understanding of conventional truth for our lives? Although we'll begin by trying to explain what emptiness means, the ultimate truth. That's not going to be my emphasis. I have done that in other classes. I've emphasized that in other classes, but I want to focus like the cowherds do. I want to focus more on conventional truth. That's where we find the reason for bodhicitta. That's where we find techniques for how we live in the world in a humane and productive way, which these days I think are particularly important since the world seems to be going insane around us. Seems to be the subject of conversation that I have with a lot of people, and it doesn't seem to be getting less insane at any time. Cowherds brought together a group of essays for a second book, which they called Moon Paths. First book they called Moon Shadows. This is the description of the book. And by the way, these descriptions were written by the authors. They weren't, they didn't come out of thin air. The Mahayana tradition in Buddhist philosophy is defined by its ethical orientation, the adoption of bodhicitta, the aspiration to attain awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. And indeed, this tradition is known for its literature on ethics, which reflect the Madhyamaka tradition of philosophy, and emphasizes both the imperative to cultivate an understanding of universal care, or universal responsibility, karuna, grounded in the realization of emptiness. And so this is important to understand, that compassion, the enactment of compassion and the attitude of compassion is grounded in the understanding intellectually and then through direct experience of the emptiness nature of things, their ultimate way of being. Karuna is grounded in the realization of emptiness, impermanence, independence, and the absence of any self in persons or other phenomena. This position is morally very attractive, but raises an important problem. If all phenomena, including persons and actions, are only conventionally real, can moral injunctions or principles be binding, or does the conventional status of the reality we inhabit condemn us to an ethical relativism or nihilism? This is the great danger of misunderstanding Nagarjuna's teachings. And Nagarjuna himself was aware of the problem. And in one of his stanzas, he said, an incorrectly grasped emptiness, which is to say an incorrectly understood emptiness, is worse than grabbing a snake by the tail. You know what happens if you grab a rattlesnake by the tail? You're going to get bit. You have to grab it, if you're going to grab it, behind the head to avoid being bitten. He's saying this misunderstanding of emptiness is incredibly dangerous, it leads to nihilism. And I understand this from personal experience. And I've alluded to this in other classes that I've done here, because when I was deep into the translating of Nagarjuna, I did fall to the nihilistic extreme for a while. And it was pretty awful, because one of the places it leads is to what's the point of being alive? Another place that the nihilism leads to is, well, if everything is empty and nothing is real, then you can do anything you want. That leads to some of the abuses that we've seen in Buddhist monastic situations. And because of my own experience of having lived at San Francisco Zen Center, I know its history, and that was a problem with one of its abbots, Baker Roshi, who seems to have thought that Buddhist morality did not really apply to him because of whatever. I don't know what that was. Well, it did apply to him, and it created huge problems. In Moon Paths, the cowherds addressed an analogous problem in the domain of epistemology and argues that the Madhyamaka tradition has the resources to develop a robust account of truth and knowledge within the context of conventional reality. The essays explore a variety of ways in which to understand important Buddhist texts on ethics and Mahayana moral theory so as to make sense of the genuine force of morality. So that's the surprising thing, that deeply understanding the nature of emptiness leads to a profoundly moral position in how we relate to the world, how we live in the world, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the other life forms in the world. And this would not necessarily logically occur to us, possibly because we misunderstand the nature of the emptiness teachings. But I would say more likely because we haven't experienced the emptiness nature of phenomena. Because from my point of view, it all comes down to this. The Buddhist teachings about reality, about emptiness, about how phenomena exist, are designed to engage our mental functions, to engage the mind. Excuse me. But only in the beginning. Because then one needs to contemplate, think about these teachings, debate them as they do in the monasteries, and then meditate on them and begin to develop, as much as one is capable of doing so, a direct experience of emptiness. Because an intellectual understanding of emptiness might tend to change the way in which you behave in the world. But I kind of feel it's a little bit like New Year's resolutions. You know, the first of the year comes around and you say, that's it. I'm off coffee. No more coffee. I'm just not going to drink any more coffee. That's my resolution for the new year. That's fine. And then the second week of the new year rolls around, or the third week of the new year rolls around, and you know that's been your resolution. And you haven't had any coffee, but you wake up one morning having had a restless tossing and turning night, and you have to go to work, and you think, how in the world am I going to get through the workday feeling like this? I better have a cup of coffee. I know. I vowed I was not going to drink any coffee, but this is an exception. I have to have a cup of coffee. And then one thing leads to another, and pretty soon you're back to your coffee drinking habit. Well, I think an intellectual understanding of emptiness does lead us into stronger moral positions, but then things happen. You know, life happens, and maybe the intellectual understanding doesn't hold up quite so strongly in the face of some situation we find ourselves in, some emotional thing that's going on, or some pain or difficulty we're experiencing, and then boom, you know, our understanding doesn't really lead into the best possible behaviors, you know, and then we try and get our act together and oh no, I understand the emptiness nature of things, and I really need to, you know, have the bodhicitta attitude, and so on and so forth. And, you know, and it just goes back and forth. But the thing about experience is it sticks. You know, you may tell the child, I mean, this is the classic example, you might tell the child that sticking your finger in a flame is going to hurt. But until the child lights a match and feels the flame, they don't get it. And you don't have to do it a second time. Once you've stuck your finger in the flame of a match as a child, you don't do it a second time. You got it. That's it, right? That's direct experience. That's the power of direct experience. So it's explicit in this tradition that you start with an intellectual understanding. And that's what we'll be talking about in these lectures. but you move on to that to meditate on what you've understood intellectually so that you get the direct experience. And it is possible. In the previous couple of classes, I've talked about the need to develop one-pointed meditation so that you can actually sit and keep a focused mind on the particular issue that you're attending to. And then you get the breakthrough, right? You begin to see directly what's happening. It's a difficult process. As all the teachers say, it doesn't happen overnight. This process is not I'm going to sit down and I'm going to go up to Crestone and I'm going to do a 1 month meditation retreat with some Lama up there, which is a wonderful thing to do. But then as a result of that meditation retreat, I'm going to be a different person. I'm going to be freed from samsara or whatever, but it just doesn't work that way, right? That might give you a foundation, and then you spend the rest of your life working through the effort to become more and more free. That's really what the path is about. That's what Lamrim is about. That's what Geshe Sherab is teaching, the steps to get there bit by bit by bit. But in my experience, even if we can't develop shamatha, even if we can't develop one-pointed meditation, it's really important to try. It's really important to get the intellectual understanding and then try and get some experience. Because every little bit of experience actually changes us. And we become different people as a result. So it's not like, you go to retreat and you wake up at the end of the retreat and you go home and you're a completely different person. You might be a little bit different, but you're not going to be enlightened or something like that. Yet if you work at it day by day, year by year, you do change. And it does happen. I mean, people say, hey, David, you've changed. I haven't seen you in a few years and you're looking different in these positive ways. Why is that? Well, because I sit down every morning that I can. Some mornings I can't. And I meditate on the nature of emptiness. I do it within the context of tantric practice. That's one way to do it. But you do it. And then you realize things, and then things change. Okay. So that's the point of this. Now let's go back to this Lama Zopa thing that I read about the base, this mysterious base that he was talking about. You walk into a room and you see a table, and it's not the table. He goes on and on about this in the second chapter. So here's what he's talking about. Let me compose my thoughts here for a minute. This tradition is asserting that how we experience things is, in a sense, somewhat arbitrary and constructed. I think most people in the world just think that the world is exactly what they see it as, and they don't give it another thought. You wake up in the morning, get in the car, go to work, there's a traffic jam, whatever. I mean, things are the way they are, and there's no really reflection on the question of, might there be some error in what I'm experiencing. I remember in a job that I had, somebody that I worked with in IT came in the office one day and he was just in a cruddy mood. And so I asked him what was going on, and he'd been in a meeting the previous day. And people have been arguing about how to solve some sort of technological problem for the university's network of internet network. And he knew he had the right answer, and he tried to make his point in this conversation that was going on. And people didn't necessarily think that he had the right answer. They thought they had the right answer. And I don't know how the thing was resolved, but obviously they hadn't adopted his view. And I said, how did you know that you have the right answer? He said, because, I thought about it and that was it. And I said, did it ever occur to you that maybe your thoughts were wrong? That you might be wrong in what you were thinking about? And his jaw kind of dropped and he looked at me like, what? It had in his entire life never occurred to him that if he had a thought, it might be a wrong thought, that it might be an error. And I think he walked away from that conversation slightly befuddled, and within the next 10 minutes, he'd forgotten about everything that we'd said, and he went back to his usual habit of, if I think it, it's true, without any self-reflection. But if we're here together in this class, we're self-reflective, and we're kind of curious to know if what we think is true. Now, what Lama Zopa is saying is, when you walk into a room, for example, and you see a table, you just see it as a table. There it is. There's a table. There's stuff sitting on the table. It's a table. But what is actually going on? Well, what Zopa Rinpoche is saying is what's actually going on is that an image has appeared in your field of vision, and you recognize that image with a word or a concept. And you may not even know that that word or concept is going on in the back of your mind. But that word or concept is table. That's the label that he's talking about. You immediately label what you're looking at as a table. Why is it a table? Well, there are things that are sitting on it. That's what tables do. Things sit on them. Well, over to my right, there is something that was marketed as a coffee table. And it has a Tibetan rug on it, and it has a zafu on it. And every morning, I sit on it and I meditate. Is that a table? Or is it a couch? Or is it a what? So Shayla says it's a table. I never think of it as a table. I think of it as my meditation throne. To me, it's a throne. I know that's puffed up, but it's where I look for my Buddha nature, and Buddhas sit on thrones. So it's my throne. It's not a coffee table. It's never been a coffee table. In 15 years, there's never been a cup of coffee on that table. The only thing that's ever been on that table is me. But I'm calling it a table. Okay. So what is it? Yeah, Sheila.
You did say that things sit on it and you sit on it.
You got me. So there's something on it. Okay. Maybe it wasn't the best example. But you get the idea of what I'm trying to get across here, is that there are circumstances that whether we're aware of it or not, there are circumstances that cause us to label things in certain ways. And because we label things in those ways, we take them to be exactly what they are as labeled. Now, if we were to look closely at this phenomenon that's being labeled a table, whether there's a computer sitting on it, or a coffee cup, or David's behind, if we look closely at this thing that's being labeled as a table, we notice a couple of things. For one thing, we notice that it's made up out of parts. But mostly when we look at a table, we don't see that it's made up of parts, unless it's starting to fall apart for some reason. And if you watch the language, falling apart, right, then we notice it's made of parts. And if it's falling apart, we do something, we glue it back together, we nail it back together or something like that. But mostly we don't notice that it's made of parts. In the case of my throne over here, my wife says, what? Did you say something, Kay?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I'll stop calling it a throne. In the case of my meditation seat over here, we'll get off the inflated ego stuff. In the case of my meditation seat over here, it's wood and metal. The legs are metal. Okay, so those are the parts, wood and metal. But if we looked really closely, okay, and we thought about the wood, now we don't tend to do this, but if we did, we looked really closely and we thought about the wood, we would see that actually it's not one piece of wood, it's many pieces of wood that have been probably glued together, because I don't see any nails. And if we looked really closely at any one piece of wood, we would see that it was made up of what? Wood fibers. The point is, we could follow this business of parts more and more deeply. Then we could ask ourselves, at what point are we no longer actually even looking at wood? I mean, we stopped looking at table, now we're looking at wood. But at what point are we looking so deeply into the constituency there that we're not actually even looking at wood? We're looking at what? Fibers, molecules, cellulose? I mean, what are we looking at? I don't even know what we'd be looking at. That's from the point of view of looking at this at parts. But we don't do that. We walk into the room, as Zopa Rinpoche says, and we look at the table, and there it is, table. We don't think anything of it. Does this matter? Why is this important? Well, one of the things about anything that's made up of parts is if it's compounded, which is to say it's come together, then it is definitely in time going to come apart. That's the nature of phenomena, right? They don't stay whole. They fall apart. Why do they fall apart? Because the conditions that brought them together are no longer capable of holding together, and they fall apart. So the traditional way of talking about why things are empty of what we experience them as being when we just sort of natively look at them or engage them is that there are three things at work. I've talked about this in the past. We see things as being whole, a table, but their actual nature is that they are not just whole, they're also made of parts. Both things are true, okay? But we ignore one part. We ignore that it's made of parts. We also ignore the fact that things exist temporally, that they arise in dependence on causes, and as a consequence of that, things are going to happen to them. We just see them as they are. We don't see them in the stream of time. And the other thing is that we don't recognize that we're labeling them. We think that's just a table. We don't recognize that there is something there that gets the label table. So that's the basic epistemology. Now, you could say, okay, Mr. Philosophy Professor, that's very nice, but why does it matter? Well, most of the time it probably doesn't matter. But some of the time it really does matter. Excuse me. For example, if we look at our lives, if we look at our body, I mean, we make it a habit to not think about the fact that we're made up of parts. I mean, I don't exactly know how physicians look at people, given the fact that in order to become a physician, you had to dissect a cadaver. I mean, when you look at somebody, do you see all that stuff that's underneath the skin? What do you see? I mean, I don't know. I've never actually asked a doctor about this. My guess is that they go back and forth, and most of the time they just see the skin bag like the rest of us. And if they find an attractive person, they're attractive. That person is attractive. They don't think about all the stuff that's going on under the surface. You know, they just find them attractive. In the old Buddhist traditions, the Buddha recommended that actually you think about these things. That when you look at a person, you think about the fact that their skin and bones and pus and mucus and all kinds of stuff. He recommended that as a way to deal with the problem of sexual desire, among other things, because the monks were celibate. But more than that, it's a way of understanding the reality of what we are. Well, why would that matter? Well, it does matter to understand the reality of what we are, because it is what we are, and it's going to create our future as it has created our past. So, okay, I'm 76 years old, and I can tell you that the stuff underneath the skin in this skin bag is not doing what it used to do when I was 20, right? I've got a different digestion, that's for sure. My heart is not the heart that I had when I was a 20-year-old. That's absolutely for sure. And, go on and on and on. I won't go into the gruesome details of being old. You can probably imagine if you're old enough, and if you're not, you can just, this is what's waiting for you. Well, when I was younger, it might have been useful to know in reality what was going to happen when I was older. I might have appreciated being younger a whole lot more. And I might not have been quite so irritated when I got old about all this stuff that was happening. And I remember my father, who died at 86, in about the last 15, 20 years of his life, he was angry all the time. Why was he angry? Oh my God, the skin on the back of my hand is always breaking and bruising, and this is happening to my body, and that's happening to my body, and I'm always going to the doctor, and he's always angry about all of this. And I thought, gee, Dad, what did you expect to have happen? I mean, this is what happens when you get old, so why are you being angry about it? What is the point of, I didn't tell him that. There wasn't any point in telling him that, because I was his son. Why would he listen to anything I had to say? He was the father. Well, apart from family dynamics, it was like, why would you want to grow old and be angry at your body? I mean, this is a natural process that is going to change, right? Well, we ignore that. We live in a culture that really pays a whole lot of, puts a whole lot of energy into ignoring the reality of what it's like to be alive, which is, it's a process. It starts one way and it moves through some stuff and it ends up another way. It's the natural course of things. Might as well make peace with it early on, and certainly make peace with it later, because it's the way it is. Or our minds. Okay. I mean, I was commenting earlier that, my memory is like Chandrakirti. When did he live? Oh yeah, that's right. 5th century CE. I couldn't remember. I mean, I've forgotten so much. It's incredible. Right? Why did I learn it all in the first place? Well, it was useful at one point, and now it's kind of disappearing. And so, there are things you can do about it. Like my wife does crossword puzzles to keep her mind sharp. I read, study philosophy, but inevitably the mind changes. And one might as well accept that that's the way it is, because it is the way it is, because phenomena change. They're impermanent. They're made of parts, and the relationship of the parts shifts over time. So that's reality. Okay, that's in relationship to the body. And then I was mentioning the mind, but what about the mind? What about consciousness? So to me, this is where these teachings get really interesting. Okay. We think of I'm not even going to talk about the I, the self, but we think of our consciousness as being unitary. And we can't help but think of it as being permanent, right? You're aware of things, and moment by moment, day by day, it's always the same awareness. I mean, if you're self-aware, that is, like if you pay attention to what's going on. I'm not talking about the average person in the street. I'm talking about people who are interested in the Buddha Dharma, for example. You pay attention to what's going on in your awareness. You pay attention to what's going on in your consciousness. But the first thing that you notice is that your consciousness appears to be unitary, and it appears to be unchanging. Like, you can be aware of a lot of things that are changing. Like, you're aware of this thought, you're aware of that thought. You're aware of sitting down in the morning to eat a breakfast of oatmeal, and you're aware of doing the dishes, and then you're aware of going to work or whatever you do. it always seems like the same witness awareness. But is it really the same? If you look really closely at it, the Buddhists tell us that our awareness, our consciousness, is a phenomenon that is made of parts. What kind of parts are we talking about? Moments. They say that our consciousness is made of moments. We don't notice it. But our awareness, that witness consciousness, is made of moments. So here's something I've tried on my university students. Tonight, you're going to go to sleep, hopefully. You get old enough, it's not always entirely certain what's going to happen when you go to bed, but you'll get some sleep anyway. And then you're going to wake up in the morning. And there's a period of time when you weren't aware of anything, when you were sound asleep. You may have been aware of a dream, but there's a period of time when you weren't aware of anything, right? I took a nap this afternoon, and I had to ask my wife, how long was I asleep? She said, oh, more than an hour. You know, it felt to me like I was laying on the couch for maybe 10 minutes. Well, no, you were asleep for more than an hour. I could tell, probably by my snoring or something like that, or my breathing generally, you know. She recognizes these things. So I wasn't aware of what was going on when I was sound asleep. So here's the interesting question. How come it is that we think that our consciousness or our awareness or that witness that notices what's going on is just one continuous thing, when in fact it disappears utterly in every 24 hours? It goes away. I was not aware when I was taking a nap this afternoon. It's here and it's gone. It's here and it's gone. And yet there seems to be some kind of continuity. So our waking state consciousness anyway obviously disappears. Now, if we get into Buddhist Tantra, we can find out that there's subtler and subtler levels of consciousness which have a continuity throughout sleep and wake. But from the point of view of, you know, our ordinary daily experience, we maintain this fiction that I am, or my consciousness rather, is just there and it's just permanent. When obviously it's not, because we fall asleep every night. We're very good at ignoring the obvious stuff because we don't want to deal with where that leads to. What does it lead to? It leads to the realization that I, or my consciousness, which is the most important thing in the world as far as I'm concerned, perhaps more important than my body, really, is something that comes and goes. It appears and disappears. And you know what? If it doesn't disappear for a while, you're going to be really miserable. That's the irony of this. Anybody that's experienced serious insomnia knows this. Not only is the continuity an illusion that we comfortably live with, that we like the notion of, but if we don't experience the opposite of what we think we like, we're deeply distressed, miserable people. Nobody likes sleeplessness. It's an awful condition, right? Insomnia is terrible. So what does that tell us about the way in which we're comfortable with what is fundamentally something that can't be called anything other than ignorance? We like our ignorance. I mean, isn't that interesting? Isn't that an interesting thing to think about? That we're very comfortable with this. Okay, if you're truly on the Buddhist path, you're going to attack your ignorance. And you're going to look it straight in the face, and you're going to do something about it. And that's what these teachings are all about. Looking it straight in the face and looking at the truth of things. Looking at the fact that everything is impermanent. Everything is made of parts, so it's constantly changing. And from the Prasangika Madhyamaka point of view, We've labeled everything. And that creates an interesting set of problems. That's what Zopa Rinpoche is pointing to when he's talking about the difference between the base and the table. He says, there's no table there. There's something there, but there's no table there. Why is that? Because the table is merely a label. That might be a little hard to get comfortable with or digest. Okay, so let me work with that a little bit. And then that's where I'm going to sort of call it quits for the evening. A friend of mine sends me these links to various articles that he finds on the internet. And recently he sent me a link to something from BBC Futures, I think it's called. BBC, British Broadcasting Company Futures. And they have these various interesting articles about this, that, and the other thing, most of which interest him, but don't interest me. However, recently he sent me an article about language. And guess what? The Western cognitive psychologists are on to what the Madhyamaka Prasangika Buddhists have been talking about for a long time, about the issues about labeling and how they affect the way we go about living in the world, which may or may not be trivial. Okay, and they give some interesting examples. So here's the example that I happen to like the best. If you ask an English speaker to locate the past in space and locate the present in space and locate the future in space, they'll say that the past is to their left, the future is to their right, and the present is right here. If you ask a native speaker of Hebrew to do the same thing, they'll say the past is over there to the right, the present is here, and the future is over there to the left. If you ask a traditional speaker of Mandarin Chinese, where is the past and the future? They'll say, past is up there. The present is right here. The future is down there. Now, why is this? It's because English is written from left to right. Hebrew is written from right to left. Mandarin Chinese traditionally was written from top to bottom. So you start there and you read this way, or you start there and you read that way, or you start there and you read that way. So what you read there in the past, what you're reading now in the present, and what you will be reading over there is in the future. So we locate time in this way. Okay, maybe that's a little bit cutesy and a little bit trivial, but the point is, if time, which is certainly a relevant issue for most of us, is controlled by the structure of the written script, and how we view time is controlled by the structure of the written script, what does that mean as an example of other things? Everything that we experience, according to this Prasangika point of view, is a matter of labels that are put on to phenomena, because we understand everything through concepts. We label everything in our experience. What if our labels are erroneous? What if time really isn't over there? Or what if time really isn't over there? Or over there? Or what if that isn't the past? Or what if that isn't the past? Now, Nagarjuna in the 70 stanzas makes a big thing about what do we even mean by time? We have this idea of past, present, and future. And that's pretty damn important to us. But what is the past? And how do we know it's the past? And as he argues, and I'm not going to go into this right now, the only reason we know that something is past is we know it's not present. We know something's in the past because it's not in the present. But how do we define the present? How do we even understand the present? Well, we have these ideas about things being past and future, but they all depend on each other, is the argument that he makes. Everything is interdependent. So even the meanings of our labels are interdependent. We understand that something is in the future because it's not past and not present. The concept of future only has meaning because we have concepts of past and present. If we didn't have a concept of past or present, there'd be no concept of future. There are people who speak languages that don't have a future tense, and they live in the present differently than we do as English speakers that have a language with a future tense and a past tense. So the anthropologists have discovered this. They literally live differently on a moment-by-moment basis because they don't have any way of talking about future. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't experience time, but it does mean they experience time differently. So isn't that interesting? What would that mean if we experienced time differently? One of my teachers is constantly saying, look, if you look at your experience, what's going on is there's a constant stream of thoughts that's intruding on your moment-to-moment experience. You can be doing anything, and there's always this like real unfolding of thoughts going on in your mind. So if you look at that stuff, usually it's about the past or it's about the future. It's very rarely about the present. So you're not in the present. What would it be like to live in the present? Most of us don't really live in the present very much. We're living in our minds, and our minds aren't very much in the present. Says, what would it be like if your mind was in the present? What would the experience look like? And so then he teaches specific meditation techniques. Excuse me. To bring that about. Or as the Ram Dass book famously said, be here now. Easier said than done. But what this whole teaching, Madhyamaka Prasangika, is about is understanding the labeling process and the errors that are created in labeling to get at the reality of what's there. The Zopa Rinpoche is referring to it at the base, as the base. The cowherds were talking about it in the context of the two truths as being the conventional truth of things, which is not the ultimate truth of things, but the way we live day by day. But then the point is that we can live day by day in different ways. I think that's where we're going to be ending it. We can live day by day in the present with some clarity and some peace of mind, or we can live day by day in the present with complete confusion and unhappiness. And ultimately, what this teaching is all about is the latter, or finding the latter rather than the former. And that's where I have to end things for the evening. Okay. Usually I would take questions at this point, but my voice is given out. And unfortunately, I have to meet with a student in 15 minutes for my university class who says, I don't know how to write the paper that you've assigned me, which is on interdependence and where Buddhist ethics come from based on interdependence. So I'm going to see if I can help her out. All righty. Good night. And I will be here next week. It would be nice to see you next week. So, peace.